This is the respiratory system. There is an upper respiratory system and lower respiratory system. Basically, know this anatomy for your respiratory system. Respiratory system has quite a few functions. Mainly, it is to get the gas into the body. Regulation of blood pH. Remember, carbon dioxide levels, when they're in the blood, create a lower pH. The brain detects that and tells you to breathe faster to get rid of the CO2. Voice production. Can't speak unless you're moving air past your vocal cords. Olfaction. When you inhale, you're breathing in particles which are picked up by your nerves in your nasal passages, allowing you to breathe and smell things. Innate immunity. Basically, physical protection. It is lined with mucus as well as hairs which push and trap any dust particles and virus particles down to the mucus, which is pulled down to the stomach, which has a high pH and destroys most of the bacteria. What does respiration refer to? Most people think it's just breathing in and breathing out. One is called ventilation, which is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. It's also the gas exchange between the air in the lungs and the blood. And the blood then carries those gases to the cells, where the oxygen and CO2 is then exchanged from the cells to the blood, and then reverse order again. The carbon dioxide diffuses out in the lungs and back out in the atmosphere. Your upper respiratory tract begins with your nose and nasal cavity. They do not consider the mouth part of the respiratory tract because although you do breathe through it, you also eat through it, so it's the first part of your digestive system. The nostrils are termed the nares. They are the opening to your upper respiratory tract. In the back of your nasal passage, the back is called the choana, which are openings into your nasopharynx in the upper part of the throat. You have a nasal septum right here, which separates the left and right nasal passages. Your hard palate is the upper part of your mouth made of the bone, which separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. Up in the nasal passage, above the hard palate, you have what are called conchae. There are three bony ridges that allow you to mix the air when you breathe in, and they do increase the surface of the nasal cavity as well. But when you breathe in, it swirls the air, allows the air to mix, and any dust particles in the air is then trapped in the mucus. Right up in the bone, you also have what are called sinuses. A sinus is merely a hole in the bone. Our sinuses service several functions. They warm and moisten the air, they produce voice resonance, and they lighten the bone. The nasal conchae, as you can see, are these ridges up here. Go from the upper respiratory, goes to the nasoconchae, past those to the nasopharynx, down to the oropharynx, laryngopharynx. We go through the larynx, which contains our vocal cords, into the trachea, which are cartilaginous lined tube. They break into two. One branch is called the left bronchus. The other branch is called the right bronchus, which has a more vertical angle to it. The bronchi branch into further bronchioles. Bronchioles branch further and thinner into the respiratory bronchioles, which are one cell thick, and a little bit of gas exchange takes place there. Most of the gas exchange takes place in the alveoli. These are little grape-like single cell clusters surrounded by blood capillaries where most of the oxygen exchange takes place. Alright, so number one is our nares. Two, also part of the respiratory system but part of the digestive system, is your oral cavity. Three is that chunk of cartilage you can feel in the Adam's apple in men, the larynx, or the voice box. 4 would be your apex of the right lung. 5 is the right bronchus. 6 is that muscle which helps you breathe. It forms the lower part of the thoracic cavity. 7, the bony ridges inside the nasal cavity which allow movement of air and make it swirl around. Conchae. 8, the upper pharynx, also known as the nasopharynx. Number 9, the pharynx behind your mouth, which you see when you open your mouth, oropharynx. And 10, the part of the pharynx below the oropharynx, it's called laryngopharynx because it is close to the larynx. 11, little cartilaginous lined tube keeping it open so air can breathe. Trachea. 12 is the pleural membrane surrounding the lung. 13, just the opposite of 5. 14 is when the bronchial tube breaks and divides into more branches. They call those bronchioles. And finally, at the end of every bronchiole is a grape-like cluster of sacs, the alveoli. Paranasal sinuses. Those are the sinuses, or the holes in your bones. They're air-filled cavities, and they're named for the bones in which they're located. For example, the maxillary, the frontal, submaxillary. Main job, they're lined with mucus to help us moisten the air we breathe in and warm it. So they warm and moisten the air. They do affect voice quality, allowing you to resonate. Speak with your nose pinched, and your voice won't be as resonant. They reduce skull weight. And the innate immunity is they do trap dust, virus, and bacteria in the mucus and sweep it to the stomach. Again, here's a view of the frontal sinuses, your sphenoid sinus, and looks like that's all that I can see right here. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx is also called the hypopharynx. The uvula is not labeled here. However, we should also know that because the uvula, when swallowing, keeps liquids from entering up into the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is from the choana, or the back opening of the nasal passages, down to the uvula. And there is the uvula. Soft palate is posterior to the hard palate, and it forms the floor of your nasopharynx. Your soft palate also helps close off and allowing the liquids to go down the esophagus instead of backing up into your nasal passage. You might have had this happen when you're laughing sometimes while drinking and liquids sneak back up into your nasopharynx. Pharyngeal tonsils. There are a couple of pharyngeal tonsils that do not look too healthy. Matter of fact, they're infected and inflamed. The oropharynx, again, goes from the uvula down to the epiglottis. Epiglottis is the little flap on top of the glottis, or on top of your pharynx, which keeps the food from going into your trachea and allows it to go down the esophagus. Food, fluid, and air passage. Food goes down this far, and at the epiglottis, it makes sure it goes down the esophagus and not into the trachea. Laryngopharynx is the epiglottis to the esophagus. What keeps food from entering the nasopharynx? The uvula and the soft palate. What keeps food from entering the larynx and the trachea? a little flap on top of your larynx called the epiglottis. What is the name of the opening into the voice box? That is the glottis, hence the name epiglottis. Epi is upon. Proper term of the voice box. That is larynx. And here is the larynx broken down. You have the thyroid cartilage, or cricoid cartilage. Laryngeal prominence in males is pronounced, producing an Adam's apple. Females is not so pronounced. You have the hyoid bone, that bone which sits under your tongue, which you can grab and feel, which is really attached to no other bone. And then your tracheal cartilage are C-shaped cartilaginous rings holding the trachea open so you can breathe. They're not O-shaped rings because the esophagus is directly behind them. And when you are swallowing food through the esophagus, it allows the esophagus to stretch into these C-shaped rings, which not only allows it to stretch, but also closes off the trachea so you're not trying to breathe while you're swallowing. Lower respiratory tract begins at the larynx. Lower larynx. The larynx begins the lower respiratory tract. It actually connects your pharynx to the trachea. There are 9 cartilaginous pieces, as you saw before, the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage, and several others, which we're not going to talk about at this level. You have 3 unpaired cartilage. The third unpaired cartilage, rather, is the epiglottis, and that does prevent food from entering the larynx. Epiglottis prevents food from entering into the trachea. Your vocal cords, as seen from above in the picture below, you have 2 pairs of ligaments. The vestibular folds are called your false vocal cords, and then your true vocal cords are able to change shape, which control your pitch. So if you tighten them up, you can speak like Mickey Mouse. If you loosen them up a lot, your voice can get really deep. And again, the epiglottis will flap down when you're swallowing. This is a sagittal section allowing you to see the false vocal cords and the vocal folds, as well as the trachea. This is a cross section from above, a diagram straight out of your textbook showing the vocal cords and your vestibular or false vocal folds on the outside. Trachea is deep to that, and the esophagus is posterior to your trachea. Trachea is also known as the windpipe. Again, it is made with C-shaped cartilaginous rings which help hold the tube open. Connects the larynx down to the bronchi. So from the larynx to the bronchi, this is called your trachea. Your bronchi. You have a left and a right bronchi, or bronchus. They branch from the trachea to the left and right lungs, and they form what's called the tracheobronchial tree, made of many bronchioles. This eventually branches several times to become the respiratory bronchioles, as I alluded to earlier, where oxygen and CO2 can actually go through. And the alveoli are at the very end of the bronchioles, where most oxygen and gas exchange takes place. Once again, a diagram showing how the trachea branches the bronchus, the bronchial tree. At the very end, you have your alveoli. You will notice that you have a gap in your left lung where the heart sits, because the heart is slightly off to the left. You have 300 million alveoli sacs covered with capillaries for gas exchange. When you cough excessively hard, you can burst these. This is a lot of alveoli sacs. This concludes part 1 of the Introduction to Respiratory System.